Hello everyone, my name is Leroy Smith, and I'm the proud founder and CEO at Realize Curriculum Solutions. Welcome to our mini lesson on communicating in linguistically and culturally responsive ways. Our mini lesson series is structured to support you, whether you are a parent or caregiver or educational professional, with meeting the diverse learning needs of your students. That is our mission here at Realize Curriculum Solutions, and we provide you with strategies and tools to do that. This mini lesson is all focused on communication, and this is one of our culturally responsive teaching and pedagogy competencies. We have covered so much about culturally responsive and linguistically responsive pedagogy so far in our mini lessons. And we want to give you some tips here, 3 tips on how you can communicate with your students in linguistically and culturally responsive ways to not only promote safety within your learning environment, but to also ensure success within your learning environments for all students. Let's get started. Tip number 1, identify verbal and nonverbal cues and styles. As a part of our humanity, we communicate in a myriad of ways all throughout the world, and we often put those kind of communications into 2 buckets, if you want to think of it that way. Verbal communication, meaning using the vocal cords or making some kind of sounds and words and sentences that we're putting together, or songs or clicks. And nonverbal communication, how we communicate with our bodies, our hands, our faces, our feet. And so we have different verbal and nonverbal cues from our students and their families. And even we have them from how we were brought up. So it's very important to understand, how are your students communicating with each other? How are they communicating respect with each other and disrespect with each other? How are they communicating appreciation for each other? And are they doing that verbally with words, or are they doing that non-verbally? For example, some people choose a particular style. They like showing their affection for people by giving them a hug, or giving them a dap in the Black community, or giving them a fist bump. That's a non-verbal cue and a style of saying, I want to acknowledge that you're here in this space that we share together. Or they might identify verbally, such as, good morning. Hey, how are you? I missed you. It's been a while. What's up, my friend? What's up, my brother? What's up, my sister? These are all ways that students and families, and even we as educational professionals and just caring adults in general, how we communicate with each other. So identifying those verbal and nonverbal cues and styles would be essential for you to understand what your students are saying in order for you to effectively respond to what your students are saying. Tip number 2, decipher dialects. You're probably wondering, well, aren't we supposed to be teaching standard English or Spanish or whatever academic language is of that class? Well, yes, but it doesn't mean that you can't decipher the dialects of your students. Deciphering these dialects will help you better understand how to respond to your students. And we're going to get into that last tip on how you bridge the difference between your students' dialects and the academic language and content they're supposed to know, so that you can connect those 2 pieces of information so that there is shared language, but also increased learning opportunities for students and success. So deciphering dialects means, do you understand when students are saying, what's up? What does that mean? Do you understand when a student says something that you might think is offensive? It's actually, it may sound like an insult to you, but it might be a term of endearment to other students in their peer group. So deciphering these dialects will help you understand not only what are positive forms of language among your students and their families and communities, but also what are negative, kind of like inflammatory language that are shared in the dialect towards each other. This is a way that we protect our students and keep them safe, but for us to also know how to respond to things when we hear them. Because if you don't understand the dialects of students and people in general, we switch to our language that we know that someone doesn't understand in our peer group so that we can talk amongst each other and have a private conversation, whether it's for good or bad. And so when you decipher those dialects, you're tuned in to what your students are saying and how they're saying it, and you then better know how to respond and communicate with your students when you know about their dialects and what comes with it. Tip number 3, bridge language divides. We've already talked about initially just identifying the verbal and nonverbal cues and styles of students. Then we talked about deciphering dialects, and now this is the last step, the last tip. After we better understood our students' language cues, whether they're verbal or nonverbal, after we figured out the dialects, now it's time to bridge the language divide. Because as educational professionals and parents and caregivers, we still have an expectation of teaching our students academic language so that they can better understand the content areas that they're learning. So we must bridge these divides. These are also called bridging activities in a dual language and multilingual world, bridging between two different languages to show how they're similar, or kind of like the metalinguistics part, seeing which parts are similar, which parts are different in the language, and how they're accented or not, or how they're presented or not. This is super important because our students need to connect their dialect with something that's academic. For an example, let's think of, maybe in math, we say deficit as language to show that there's not enough revenue coming into a business or to a country or to a state. But maybe our students' dialect for a deficit in their community is called being broke. And so, yes, being broke may be the dialect, but how do we bridge that and say, yes, a deficit is like a business or a nation state being broke? That allows students to bridge those connections in their mind that, yes, my language, the language I speak at home and in my community and among my peer group, is helping me learn better. It's not that your dialect is less important. It is equally important to get you to understand the academic language that's necessary for success within that content area. So tip number 3 is kind of putting everything together, synthesizing everything, is to bridge those language divides. All right, let's recap this mini lesson on communicating in linguistically and culturally responsive ways. Tip number 1 is to identify the verbal and the nonverbal cues and styles of your students and yourselves and other adults within those learning communities. Tip number 2 is all about deciphering and digging in and dialing in to your students and even the adults around you dialects. And that leads us to tip number 3, which is to bridge those language divides, or to bring our students' nonverbal and verbal cues and dialects together so that we can help them more efficiently and effectively learn the academic language necessary to be successful within those content areas that we're teaching. This mini lesson was kind of like almost like a summary of so much and a synthesis of so much we've been learning so much about culturally responsive pedagogy and teaching. And I hope you learned so much here because it's so important to learn how to communicate with our students and their families and community partners. So, if you enjoyed this mini lesson in this video, please like it, comment on how you communicate linguistically and culturally with your students and your family members and community members. And also share it with someone who is still learning, needs some tips there on how to communicate in linguistically and culturally responsive ways. As always, I hope that you learned as much as you can, and I hope that you realize the solution that works for you today. See you soon.